is up, everybody? Welcome to the Halftime Snacks podcast. Today's snack is going to be a little bit different. For this episode, I invited Robert Geverts to snack with us about a timely topic that I thought we could explore more deeply, the famous European Super League. Robert is a sports consultant from the UK who's a former guest of the show. He also worked with Man City, Sky Sports, and other relevant brands in the industry. Robert, welcome back to the Halftime Snacks, man.
Thanks very much. It's good to be back. Good to see you again.
Okay, so let's talk about Super League, which we're recording on Thursday, this 22nd, it's, as you said, already dead. It lasted a couple of days, but let's just start from, the beginning. What is the Super League? How did we get here? Let's just go from the beginning.
Sure. So look, it's a very interesting time in European football where, the global pandemic has led potentially to the powers that be at some of the major clubs looking for new financial opportunities. I would guess that they were probably already looking for them anyway, but this has maybe accelerated some of that process somewhat. And so, obviously, as part of their ongoing conversations with UEFA around the reform of the Champions League, the teams at the very top want some more financial security, some more stability, some more control commercially over where that competition was going. And maybe they felt they weren't getting what they wanted necessarily from that. And so a few of the clubs at the very top decided to try and step out on their own, managed to secure some potential financing, was starting to have some conversations with broadcasters around a breakaway competition, which in itself on the surface is not hugely surprising. A lot of people maybe argue that this was probably just a leverage bluff somewhat to try and make sure that they could get what they wanted out of UEFA. And on the surface, again, it is no different to maybe what certain teams in the Premier League did 25, 30 years ago when they stepped away from the Football Association to create the Premier League, in creating a new model away from the status quo. The one major difference around this at the moment, which maybe was the stumbling point, and I'm sure we'll go into talking about what went wrong, was the nature of creating somewhat closed competition. So ensuring that the founding clubs, 15 founding clubs out of 20, would never be relegated or removed from the competition. So always having that level of security and really removing the competition and the meritocracy aspect from the proposition that really struck a chord with football fans, particularly in the UK. So that was what seemed to be the downfall in the short term of the proposition.
Besides COVID, on missing out on the opportunity cost of missing out on bringing fans to the stands and having people in the stadiums and selling and merchandising and everything else, what were some of the other events that you think that triggered such an idea? I saw a graph, probably you saw it as well, that most of the teams, actually all of the teams but Chelsea, had just like huge debts. Right? How do they got into like such massive debts? Why they are just disclosing those debts right now? Why now?
The player salaries continue to rise exponentially, and the big change was that obviously removing the match day revenues and ticket sales and that kind of thing. But the broadcast rights, the traditional broadcast rights, particularly in local markets, are not rising at the rate that these teams would hope. If anything, they're static or falling. And there's a conversation to be had around the general viewing habits of consumers nowadays across TV and other digital platforms, and the best ways for rights holders, governing bodies and teams to reach consumers. Not that we want to be fans, but the reality is they're consumers nowadays. And the old model doesn't necessarily work as well anymore, because younger people don't watch TV in the way that traditionally people consumed TV a few years ago. And so the challenge is always, how do you reach those younger demographics? And these teams, particularly led, it seems, by Senor Perez at Real Madrid, felt like they needed to do something different to reach a younger fan base. Now, I would argue that partnering just directly with a digital streaming service is not necessarily going to be the way that you engage and interact with a very young demographic. But in principle, the idea was that to try and rip up the rule book and start again, to try and make sure you're engaging with those audiences. Now, you could argue that actually a better way to engage with younger people is to reduce ticket prices and get younger people to come into stadiums in the first place. But again, that's a different conversation.
Yeah, like what you mentioned just before, that this could be a potential leverage to push changes either in Champions League, Europa League, or in the way they distribute money, in the way big clubs financially support smaller clubs. But one of the things that are ringing in my head is like, this is something that takes time to plan. This is something that, it's not just like a Zoom call between, Perez and the Glazier brothers out there in Manchester, and probably Abramovich as well. It doesn't take like a Zoom call to be like, hey, let's just create this, right? It takes probably months of conversations, of discussions, of like things that are happening also inside teams. So I wonder like how long it took them to figure out that this was like what they needed to do, what they needed to suggest, at least, because now it's not even going to be done. But like, in your mind, how long does it take to plan such a project? And why do you think also that planning, everyone was like, okay, yeah, this is a good idea, let's do it, let's go for the money, let's, like, why they didn't thought about what's going to go wrong before? What are your thoughts around that?
There's a lot of potential factors that have gone into what happened and how it happened. So from one point of view, you look at the fact that there are, out of the 12 teams, 4 teams are owned by American owners, 3 of which I think as a minimum have also investment in American sports teams and are much more familiar with the American sports model of business, where it is a closed competition. There is a floor level for revenues that that there are secured, there is revenue sharing, there are competitive rules in place to ensure parity amongst all teams. And one could argue that the opportunity for these American owners has always been to try and move European football, and by default their investment, into that space first of all. I'm not saying that's what happened, but that is a school of thought that you could join dots around. The next thing I think to understand is when you talk about the time that it takes to do these kind of things. One thing I think that actually helped this process is the pandemic, in the sense that this never really got out because no one was seen meeting with someone else. No one, the Glazers weren't seen leaving the Madrid offices or a hotel in wherever, having chatted with this person or that person. Everything could be done virtually, digitally, and therefore kind of untraceable in that sense. So it could have been the kind of thing that was pulled together relatively quickly. Also, I don't think they necessarily had the complete buy-in of all the teams at the same point to the same level. There will be a number of teams that were really worried about missing the opportunity and jumped on board as a last resort rather than really driving through the proposition. And again, you can probably see, if you read between the lines, the teams that jumped away from this quickly were probably the ones that never really wanted to do it in the first place, but felt like they had to because they didn't want to get left behind in whatever the outcome would have been. So I think there's a number of factors. But also, there must have been initial conversations with broadcasters, but the fact they didn't go to market saying we have a deal with someone shows that those conversations hadn't been done in any great detail. And even then, it's a hugely difficult landscape to navigate because there are so many incumbent broadcasters with deals with UEFA and with FIFA that this new proposition would completely undermine their investment there. So whether it is Sky in the UK or DAZN or Amazon even, Amazon have Premier League rights here in the UK. would they really want to kind of undermine that investment by potentially investing in something else that would then take arguably the six biggest names from the Premier League away from that competition? So I think it was just the actual announcement process was probably rushed out and pushed out, and you could see that by the lack of depth in what was put out, and therefore, how quickly the U-turn appeared.
Yeah, I think also what you mentioned about the US American leagues, the NBA, the NFL, they have systems in which they bring players from college where the worst team in the season has the first pick. Next season makes it a little bit more competitive. It brings in balance. Such a system does not exist in European football. I think that the way that the money is distributed, the access to capital, being Real Madrid and coming to, JP Morgan or even another bank and saying, I want X amount of loan, probably is easier to get it than like a smaller club like Apoel or, Zenit or just any other team in Europe. So there's a lot of like micro issues that are, that we can see in the current system and how it works. But I want to know from your perspective, mostly because you worked at Man City and you kind of like you have some insight, insider insight. What is happening behind the scenes? Like, what are the conversations between the employees at let's say like Chelsea or Man City or Tottenham, or like the employees that are working there? Like, what are they talking about? What, like, are they taking sides? Are they saying like how they feel, or like what's happening there? Do you have any sort of like insight or something?
I wish I did, but I think the reality is, if you look at and you read what's going on at the moment, no one knew. Like, no one was involved. These conversations were held at the highest level, and that's kind of what's so surprising, was that there are some very smart people working in the industry, working at these clubs, in roles that are, there are more and more departments that are created nowadays around operational strategy that would be employed to investigate this kind of scenario and figure out what's the best way to do this, and what factors do you need to mitigate, and what challenges would there be, and what would be the benefits, and how do we need to explain this to our stakeholders, our fans, our sponsors, our players. And it seems obvious that they weren't consulted at all, which is why this has ended up how it was. From what I hear, what you read and see, various senior level directors at various clubs weren't involved in this have come out and said they weren't involved, whether it's Paolo Maldini at Milan, whether it is the coaches and the management teams at the various clubs. It just seems like this was a few really rich guys thinking, oh, we've done investment deals before. Here's another I've got this great idea. Let's make this a huge investment and really secure our long-term financial viability in this space.
But this really takes away their credibility, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, for some of these guys, I don't think they mind. I don't think it makes a huge dent. I think it's they took a risk. They thought it would work out. It hasn't. They still got loads of money. They've still got big investments. And the worst case, what happens if? So obviously, at the moment, a number of teams are now, the clubs and the fans in particular, are trying to push back against the ownership. Yeah. So what happens is they say, okay, I don't want the aggravation of people hating me anymore. I'm going to sell and make money on my initial investment. There's still enough rich people out there that want to buy into professional football. It still could be a decent investment for, funds or really rich guys. So, they don't really lose in this situation. It's just they don't win as much as maybe they thought they would in the first place.
Yeah, now that you mention it, I caught myself thinking, how many of the fans follow a team because of management? And the answer probably is close to zero, but I wonder, that's because I feel like, at least for me, I feel like a team is eventually kind of becomes part of your identity. You kind of feel like you identify yourself as someone that would do the same things that your team would, no? So I wonder how many really get angry at their teams, or even stop being a fan of their teams because of these actions by, as you mentioned, the top hierarchical level managers or owners, and not even consult the strategy team in their own like group of employees that are really devoted to, as you mentioned, do things like this properly. So it's an interesting discussion, I guess.
Yeah, it goes back to the initial kind of creation of these teams, that they were community places. They were a team of guys that worked in the same factory, or they were the team for the local town. And it's all about being part of a community, having shared beliefs, shared ideals and values. And so that's kind of what still remains in the eyes of the fans, of the true fans. And again, part of the mistakes maybe that's been made is that these owners were not necessarily interested in the true fans. They were more interested in the global follower, in that kind of extended number that every team quotes, whether it's Man United claiming they've got 2 billion fans around the world or whatever. And even though actually their hardcore group is maybe more like 200,000, 300,000, whatever the number is, even 500,000, that are going to be their highest spenders, but actually the growth opportunity is in the other 1.5 billion. And that's kind of what they're looking at. But what has shown is that actually the power of that hardcore has been enough to make these guys think again, because the fear is that combined with the outside interference from broadcasters, again, the cynic in me says, well, as soon as the broadcasters pulled back, which they probably did, and the sponsors pulled back, then actually the financial projections they put to JP Morgan around what the investment would be maybe doesn't stack up quite as well, if actually Amazon aren't going to come to the table and Disney aren't going to come to the table with a big deal because it's a bit too dirty for them to get around. And brand sponsor A isn't going to be associated with that kind of thing because they don't want it to reflect their own brand values. And realistically, the cynic in me says that that's probably what happened more than the fan backlash.
Yeah.
Because like we said, these guys, they don't care. They go home and cry to their bank balance. They really don't mind being unliked most of the time. It doesn't matter.
I also guess that us as fans, we want to believe that the story that, we were the ones that prevented this from happening. We were the ones that, stood outside the stadiums and raised some, signs saying we're against. That's the story we want to believe. At the end of the day, it's also about the story. Sports is about the story. Sport is about who did what, and I guess that for the fans, feeling that they were the ones that really, pushed this and it created at least some sort of pressure, if it's not for them, for the sponsors, that then were the catalyst that prevented this from happening, then I guess that it makes sense at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Like, don't get me wrong, right? It's a great story that the fans did this, right? And Twitter has been amazing for the last 2 days. Football Twitter has been the place to be in looking and seeing the response. It has been absolute gold.
Hey, what if they wanted
is it
this,
actually
this
true
to happen in the first place? What if, teams were like, you need to push some fan momentum. We need to bring fans, together again. What if we create this that, it makes them unite against us, but in terms they become more, passionate about it. What if this was the plan? You don't know.
Well, there's only so much the fans can do. I mean, I've seen many fan demonstrations at owners previously, and most of them fall on deaf ears. It doesn't really happen. I think the one difference, as this has been a totally unified situation with, particularly here in the UK, with fans from all 6 English teams and broadcasters and former players, and everyone has been from the same viewpoint of, this is wrong, we need to do something. We don't know what, but we need to do something. And that has, now, whether or not that actually led to the U-turn is kind of irrelevant, because one thing happened and then another thing happened that is a good thing. And so let's take this as a big win for people, even if, the reality is probably that the money and the numbers didn't stack up at the end of the day, which is why some of these guys turned around and said maybe not. But it's good that they still do want to keep their stakeholders happy as much as possible.
True.
But, certain teams have had a track record of behaving in a way that doesn't necessarily fit with what the fans want, and they've carried on anyway, and they keep apologizing. Oh, we'll never do it again. And they do it again, and they do it again, and they do it again. So, I'm not going to be, people can look for the examples in the recent past. I'm not going to say any particular teams, but there's plenty of examples there where, they haven't listened to the fans, or they've U-turned for various reasons and said, oh, we're sorry, we won't do it again. And then 6 months later, they do something else.
Let's distill what the problems are, and just to recap a little bit of what we talked about now. The thing is that rich clubs are basically financially supporting smaller teams. They have tons of debt. They were looking for a solution that would bring them a lot of money. We understand that this is not viable, and this is not something that can happen because of the fans, because of all the things that we talked about. But what are some of the solutions, Robert? In your mind, you're a digital consultant, you are a commercial consultant. So what would you advise those teams or leagues? We also talked about, the problems behind distribution of money, access to capital, the whole, problem of competitivity. So what would you advise? What, in your mind, what are some of the solutions that could solve these problems?
I think one of the interesting aspects for me is, and again, this links into the current conversations with UEFA and the teams as well, is that one of the sticking points is that the teams want more control over the commercial sales process. So currently with UEFA sells marketing rights to the Champions League as a group en masse, if you like. So they have 5 or 6 partners, and that's it. And they own all of the inventory around the Champions League. And certain teams, particularly at the top end, feel like they're getting kind of shortchanged, that they have the skills and the resources and the relationships to get better commercial deals for themselves than their slice of the UEFA overall pot. And so I do feel like there are some great guys out there, great teams, and great opportunities. So I think that is a probably a fair assumption for a number of those teams. But it does then create the gap between the haves and the have-nots, that if every team were reliant on creating their own commercial revenue, then yes, those top 12, 15, 20 teams may get an increase on the money that UEFA provide them, but everyone below that is going to get nowhere near. And so the challenge is around, well, from UEFA or whoever is the governing body, is that a challenge that you can push back on? Because ultimately the clubs do still hold a whole load of power, in that there is no Champions League and there are no big broadcast deals without some of those big name teams. And so it's finding a solution that is still fair, but fair for the bigger teams, maybe more fairer than it is fairer for the smaller teams.
Yeah, because I feel like comparing it, I saw these meme online and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. Was that if it's like if in the stock exchange you would take Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, which are the big 5 companies that basically move the S&P 500, for instance. If it's like if you would take all of those 5 companies, and that if you would open a new exchange just for them, and so that doesn't make any sense, but that's what happens. Like that's what is happening in football, in European football. There's big clubs that are exponentially bigger than the smaller clubs, and you have this difference in power that it reflects in capital, which then reflects in soccer quality or how they play. So I guess that I had just this idea having this conversation with someone else. I was saying, yeah, but in the NBA or the NFL, at least they have a salary cap. At least they are capped in the amount of money they can spend, or they can pay players. It's impossible. Like it's just mental to think that PSG can buy Mbappe and Neymar on the same summer. Just pushing out like hundreds and millions of euros to buy and form team like super teams, and then the only sanction that they get is that, oh, they can't hire anyone for another year or something. And so that makes no sense, because you're just allowing them to be unfair sometimes, and then just keep their unfairness in their teams by the amount of money that they spend or the players that they bring. So that could potentially be another area of solution, just limiting teams to what they can do and what they can't. And same goes for smaller teams, trying to be more balanced in what they have and what they can have access to. I feel like it's a coin of two sides.
The salary cap issue is always going to be difficult in the UK and in Europe, because the kind of laws and competition rights and stuff means that, I don't think that they're ever going to be in a position to put an artificial ceiling on what someone is able to earn. There are, people can earn whatever someone feels that is their value. You mentioned the NBA, and obviously the reason why the NBA has a salary cap, yes, is part of the kind of parity rules of trying to make it fair for everyone. But it's basically because the owners were able to negotiate that as part of the CBA to make sure the costs were kept to a certain level. The closer comparison actually is baseball and MLB. So they don't have a salary cap, but they still have a closed network of teams. There's no promotion and relegation. There's no incentive to be good or bad necessarily, only the competition of winning. And even then, there's only ever one winner at the end of the year. They don't have a salary cap, but they still have a decent turnover of success for teams year after year. It isn't always the Yankees and the Red Sox and the Dodgers that are playing in the World Series every year. And some teams, they, depending on their ownership, the amount that they spend goes up and down quite drastically, depending on the caliber of talent they have and whether or not they decide it's the right time to push the button and go for it or not. And I think that's a more realistic model moving forward. But the heritage and history and tradition of European football has to have the element of competition, whereby you are rewarded for your success and you can start off small and grow bigger and bigger and bigger through on-field success to the point that you can compete at the very top. They can never have this closed shop nature. And that's where, that was always interesting about the MLS. And I know that there was a big conversation a while ago over there when Relevant Sports got involved and offered an obscene amount of money for the broadcast rights, on the proviso that promotion and relegation would happen with the USL and the wider football pyramid, of which the MLS declined that offer. And so it's something culturally that America just isn't comfortable with for whatever reason, but the rest of the world is. And so I think whilst there's going to be American owners at the moment, they will always want that feeling of security, and there will always be this tension until either side kind of breaks, either a major American sports model changes, or the Americans are no longer owners within the European sports model.
Yeah, man, I love that. I love that insight. And man, it's Thursday. The episode's coming out on Tuesday, and there's so many things that can happen between today and then.
We could be in a very different place in the world by then. But I think that at the moment, from where we can see, there's, the Spanish teams who, and again, let's be really frank and honest here, Real Madrid and Barcelona are in a huge amount of debt, and they were looking to try and leverage the power and success of the Premier League to try and drag themselves back up financially. So they are clinging on to anything they can to try and keep these conversations going. That's not to say that they won't be successful in finding a way, whether it is through a new proposition, whether it's through the newer version of the Champions League in whatever format that may be. They are in desperate need and will continue to do so. But also, they know that their brand and their credibility is such that they are still needed as part of the European soccer elite. So it's something that we have to watch this space and see what happens. Senor Perez is carving quite a niche for himself at the moment in the kind of media space around some of the comments that he's got out there. and we wait to see kind of what the weekend brings, and who knows where this may turn.
Yeah, I think they can also take a few years of losses. They've been very lucrative for just dozens of years, and a few years of slowdown of economic recession internally. I don't think it's so bad for them. It also kind of like maybe balances out what's happening in the leagues and the money that they move. But who knows? Who knows, Robert? I want to thank you so much for coming today to the Halftime Snack to have this fun discussion around European Super League, man. I think we got a lot of key insights with you today. I appreciate it, and I can't wait to have another discussion like this with you in the future, Robert. Thank you, man.
Before you leave, I want to thank you for listening. To hear these or any other Halftime Snack, check out the full archive on my website, which you can find on the show notes. See you next week!